Welcome to the Duttycast, the first Duttycast in a series, a monthly series, hosted by Duttyartz.com. That's Chief Boima up in your face. I'm DJ Ripley, also known as Larissa Mann. We're going to be doing these on a monthly basis, as live as you see it now. If you would like to tweet about it and follow the conversation on Twitter, we have a hashtag. It's hashtag Duttycast, DUTTYCAST. I'll introduce our awesome guests, or the fact that we have awesome guests, friends of Dutty Arts and members of Dutty Arts. Once again, I'm Larissa, DJ Ripley. I'm interested in all of these questions, but I wanted to bring in people who had actual experience in different aspects of international collaboration around music, especially where big players are involved, because all of us who do music that crosses borders end up, oh, you have to turn down that audio. All of us who do music that crosses borders end up in situations where big players are interested sometimes. Governments are interested, NGOs are interested, all that kind of thing. And sometimes those are the people that are funding us, and I was just interested in how those dynamics work. So maybe if we could start by having each of you, and also Boima, introduce yourselves and say a little about what your musical or other affiliations are, and then what projects you were a part of that are connected to these sort of international collaborations, just so we know folks' experience. Maybe you want to start?
Yeah, I'll spark it off. I'm Sam Hillmer. I'm a saxophonist, musician, composer, living in Brooklyn, and I play in a band called Z's. I play solo as Diamond Terrifier, DJ as the Oracle DJs, and I have worked with the State Department in the context of the OneBeat Festival, which Bang on a Can and Found Sound Nation produced this past fall.
Awesome, thanks.
My name's Kendra Salois. I'm an ethnomusicologist, and my interests revolve around popular musicking, which means making music, listening to music, consuming music, what musicians and fans and tastemakers do, mostly around pop music in the Middle East and North Africa. So issues of circulation, issues of neoliberalization, issues of citizenship. And my dissertation research was in Morocco, using around Moroccan hip-hop musicians and their fans, and the ways that they engage with the effects of neoliberalization and neoliberal policy, which encompasses economics and politics. So I got interested in this because my research was actually funded by the Fullbright, which is from the Department of Education, so ultimately going back to the state. And I got to see, because of that, a lot of interaction between Moroccan musicians and US musicians that were brought to Morocco by the embassy and consulate in Morocco, coming from the US to Morocco and then going to further tours abroad in the MENA region. So really interested in kind of like what happens when those groups collaborate, and the kind of interesting questions that came up as a result of the State Department's activity.
Awesome. And Boima?
My name is Boima, Chief Boima, Dutty Arts, and I guess Larissa asked me to come talk a little bit about my experiences traveling and collaborating with artists, mostly in West Africa, or artists here from all over the world. So,
thanks. And we saw one of those artists earlier, right? That was the video. One of the videos that was showing us someone you collaborate with, right?
Yes.
So
Sorry, Condi.
Sorry, Condi, for those of you.
The album will be dropping next Tuesday, no, a week, March 5th, on Dutty Arts record label.
Awesome. So great. So maybe one thing I wanted to start with is to get a sense of how these experiences happen when these different groups are brought together under the auspices of these organizations. And of course, there's all kinds of things that go on, but I'm wondering if we can start with some positives, maybe like one of the best things that you got out of the whole thing, out of doing this OneBeat collaboration. Maybe Sam, if you could talk about what was it that came out of it for you that really you look back on and go, that was really, like, that was the stuff. That was one of the reasons to be a part of it.
Sure. Well, I got to meet some really great people and hang out a lot in a really kind of in-depth and intimate way with a bunch of the folks that were fellows at the OneBeat Festival. And you know, they're musicians who I might not have met otherwise, Specifically, I befriended a woman named Matoni, the drummer queen, who's from Nairobi and makes amazing dance, world beat music, whatever, however you want to put it. And she was cool, and we had a lot of interesting exchanges, and we can talk more about that later. So that was cool. And then we ended up working on a track with Ali Shaheed Muhammad from Tribe Called Quest, which was exciting. You know, dates back to my high school interests. And so yeah, so the OneBeat curators and directors brought in an amazing swath of people, both the fellows that they attracted who applied to be part of the festival, and the collaborating artists who were, you know, curated into the festival to participate. And it was just a really interesting environment to meet a lot of great folks. And then I got to participate in some music making in ways that I'm not accustomed to. So I got to you know, do like a real performance where I was playing some, you know, small auxiliary percussion instruments in the context of like a African rhythm section, you know, which yeah, I just never got to do that before. It was awesome. Cool. Had a great time. I was playing a shaker.
in a big group of people?
Yeah, it was like, yeah, you know, like 7 people, you know.
And what was the venue? Where was it?
It was at a theater in Washington D.C. The name of which escapes me. But like a nice place, lots of people there. It was kind of, I mean, what I was doing was very straightforward. It wasn't like I was being called upon to do something difficult, but it was just a little bit outside of my comfort zone, and it was cool to do that with some people who kind of live and breathe that. So that was nice.
Awesome. Boima, do you want to maybe talk about either something, because I don't know, did you organize most of this yourself, or did you have, because you didn't have US funding, but
so what happened, how you got
there
in touch with Soy Kondi?
Yeah, so start with that one.
Okay, so this actually happened. Soy Kondi I got in touch with through a YouTube video that a friend of mine had gone to Sierra Leone to set up a organization called We Own TV, which is like a media training kind of nonprofit. And he came back after meeting the producer for the video and just shared it on Facebook. And I saw it, and right away I just bought the album and remixed it. And then there's a DJ from Germany who put it in a mix that was on a website, on the Fader website. And then so the manager or the producer who made the video contacted me and was like, "Oh, I saw you made the remix. Are you interested in collaborating further with Soy Kondi?" So I was like, "Yeah." And, you know, we'll figure out. I had just come back from Liberia, so he said I should come visit Sierra Leone to maybe do some work with him. I was like, "Well, I just came back. I don't know next time I'll be there." So so we decided, okay, well, let's figure out how to get Soy Kondi touring. And since none of us had the money, so we did a Kickstarter campaign to raise money to try to get Soy Kondi here. So that's what we did. So
it was successful.
And it was successful. And he was here last October, and he performed in Brooklyn, in DC, in Philadelphia, Boston. So yeah, it was successful, and we recorded a new album here in this space right here. And so we're releasing his Sierra Leonean album, which was the first video we played. Dogolobea, and then we're releasing that next week, and then working on producing the new album for fall.
Did you have other options other than Kickstarter? Like, could you have pursued, you know, NGO money, grant money, government money, any other places? I mean,
in theory, yeah, but it kind of gives me a headache.
Why is that?
Because it's a lot of writing and paperwork, and it was just easier to submit something to Kickstarter. I mean, not easier, but it was just Kickstarter used skills that we were already kind of developing as like a music label and as DJs and as music producers. Like Kickstarter let us use those skills as promotions and that kind of stuff. And I don't, like, at that point, I, you know, didn't really have I'm learning now how to write grants and stuff like that, but I didn't have those skills. So it was like, okay, I know how to send out some 3,000 emails and, you know, and do promotions and that kind of stuff. And it just helped me. It was just convenient for me to just use my skills.
One more question on that. When you went to Liberia before that, that wasn't funded by Kickstarter.
No.
How did you get there?
That was part of my schooling.
Oh, so it was a different institution. It was through school. That was the new school?
New school,
right. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Great. Well, it's cool because actually now we have two different sort of institutional stories for how different kinds of collaborations happen, which is really interesting. Um, One of the other sides that I wanted to ask about was sort of around the expectations that you had for what your experience was going to be like before you went there, before you got to be a part of it, and then what it was like once you actually were there, and as far as anything, how things were organized, who you ended up seeing, how you spent most of your time. And actually, I think, Kendra, you could probably talk about this in relation to the research process as much as anything else, right? So you get funding from Fullbright to go do that. So I don't know, is there anything you can talk about in terms of the way that showing up with grant and a project, like what that actually looks like once you get there?
It's kind of hard for me to discuss it in any other way because that's what my experience was.
Mhm.
So it's hard for me to like imagine the counterfactual, like if I just shown up with a backpack and not on the Fulbright. But I had access to what the embassy and consulate wanted to do around cultural diplomacy. So I was able to like go meet with cultural affairs officers at the embassy and consulate and ask them what they wanted, and they solicited ideas from me about what to like, who to bring and what projects to do and things like that. One really interesting experience, and I don't know if this speaks to your question or not, but one interesting experience late in my fieldwork was when the Casablanca consulate brought a small group of musicians from Chicago and Colorado to Casablanca and to some cities on the Atlantic coast. They did workshops. I'm sorry, I should tell you, it's the Reminders, husband and wife hip hop duo out of Colorado, and DJ Imad from Chicago, and I'm sorry, DJ Manawax, his name is Imad, and a dancer named Jonathan St. Clair, Super Inlight. And so the quartet of them kind of covered hip hop bases. And they traveled around doing workshops, talking about hip hop culture, talking about the emergence of it in the US, and meeting with B-boys and B-girls in like little towns at the Atlantic coast, doing all that kind of thing. And at the end of their week, they came in and we facilitated a roundtable between them and journalists and MCs from Casablanca. And really interesting exchanges went on how both all the artists from the US side and the Moroccan side, all of the things that they went through, sort of their everyday struggles trying to get enough money and time available to them to do what they wanted to do, right? They had really similar challenges because none of these people are like on a major label or have any kind of institutional support from a commercial side.
Right.
So really similar issues that they were facing. And that conversation was, I think, really inspiring for the Casablancan MCs because they're doing really similar workshops now.
So the Casablancan MCs are now doing similar workshops to what the Americans did?
I think it's not that they like brought the idea and then the Moroccans were like, oh, we'd never thought of that before. But seeing that idea occur, even though it was the US that provided the resources in that example, I think gave them a little more impetus to do something they'd already been thinking about doing. So more than one NGO is run by a hip hop artist in Casablanca. There's a couple of them. And they definitely reached out to lower income youth in Casablanca, but they're also branching out now into more rural towns and like little suburbs outside of cities and things like that to bring similar hip hop workshops. So they saw that process and thought that process was worth following up on.
That's really interesting. Did you ever get a sense of when you were because you're describing having access to these different places? Did you ever get a sense of what the limits on that access were? Like how that shaped what it was you were able to see or not see? Because I'm sure you saw more than you might have otherwise in some ways, right? You got to talk to people you couldn't have. But I'm wondering how, like, did you have any sense ever of other things going on that you didn't see?
I didn't expect to be interested in this angle, right? So looking back, the Fulbright, so the US institutional backing gave me the ability to get into the ways that the US is using music in cultural diplomacy. And I couldn't have done that without that kind of funding. But there was no way in which the Fulbright kept me away from what I had originally planned to do. And it also didn't help. Like, I think sometimes when you're applying for a Fulbright, sometimes people tell you, oh, this name really opens doors. And I'm sure it does in some countries, but none of the people I was interested in talking to cared at all about it.
Interesting.
And in some cases, it might have hindered my access. But on the US side, looking at that institution from on the ground in Morocco, it gave me an insight I couldn't have gotten any other way.
Right. Interesting. Maybe you can switch to Sam. I'm just wondering about you. I think you had talked when we had talked before about sort of the ways that you found people and found moments of collaboration within the structure and then also not within the structure. Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe, like what this OneBeat structure provided, and then what maybe you had to go outside it for, if you did?
Sure. So the OneBeat festival is premised on collaboration. Essentially, they bring 32 fellows from all over the world, and they really do a good job of covering all over the world. I mean, it's like literally like everywhere, like, and those people meet for 2 weeks in Florida, and there's these burgeoning collaborations that come out of that time that they spend together, and then kind of ready or not, they start a tour up the coast, and they have this kind of evolving concert that's happening.
Ready or not?
Kind of, yeah. Like, I mean, a lot of, there were things that were ready that they were presenting, and then there were collaborations that were still forming that maybe they would present at a subsequent concert. So while we were in DC, there were things that we were polishing and we were going to present in DC, and then there were things that we were still rehearsing that we would eventually present in New York. So it was this kind of like evolving,
interesting,
collaborative review of sorts, which is an interesting model, certainly a challenging one to execute with 32 people and the administrative staff and everything. I mean, I think we were like 50 deep,
wow,
all told,
that's
like
quite
50
a crew
people. So
to roll with.
To get 50 people to do this thing night after night that itself is changing each night is a real logistical just challenge, and Chris and Jeremy and the staff of OneBeat did a really good job of kind of attending to the needs of this, collaborative juggernaut. And but essentially, so the reason I'm giving all of this background is because I had a very, like, when I was invited to do OneBeat, I was asked to be very specific about the collaborating that I wanted to do. They essentially asked me to kind of take a look at their fellows and decide who I thought would be the best fit, for me in terms of like cultivating some collaborative work. And so I went through, and everybody was great. Everybody was really on what they were on. But the artist that was most interesting to me was Matoni, the drummer queen, because she had a lot of kind of resonances with just bass music, sound system music from Africa that I'm already interested in, although I wasn't familiar with any music from Nairobi or any of the artists that surround her. So that was really exciting to me to get into that. So I pitched that collaboration. They had sort of already had that in mind, and Matoni and I got in touch and shot some emails around. And I was kind of like ripping some samples out of her stuff and kind of imagining how we could do some sort of collaboration that embraced some things that I was interested in, and addressed some of what she was doing, and so on and so forth. But when we actually got there in the practice of doing it, the situation that I described, which is this kind of logistical obstacle course of getting these concerts together each night, actually made it impossible for us to actually get together during like program hours and work on this. But and so that was really interesting, because that's how I ended up playing the shaker in the more like kind of like sort of like high life type African band, which is I also like that music a lot. It wasn't what I imagined that I would do, but I did it and it was great. And so but then Matoni and I still we did really like our kind of decision to work together from afar was in fact indicative of a true resonance like between myself and her, because we just had a lot of the same interests. And like, for example, actually, Boima, it's funny that you're here. When we were in DC, she was like, oh, I'm gonna go see DJ Underdog, and then I went to see DJ Underdog, and then he gave me a flyer for the Story Kandi concert that was happening, and then I was like, oh, I'm throwing the Story Kandi show in New York, and so it was this weird thing where we were actually, unbeknownst to each other, already kind of looped into a very similar social circle. but that was something that we cultivated and explored entirely outside of the official program structure of OneBeat.
Right.
That was just like hanging out and going to, what's that place called in DC? Patty Boom Booms. Yeah.
Yep, that's what it's called.
And whatnot. Yeah, you know, and that was actually cool because then we worked. She stayed on past the festival's end in New York and came and did our night at Zebulon when the night that Sori Kandi played. So then there was some like completely off the grid, like just self-elected collaboration,
Right.
the uncompensated self-elected collaboration that came out of it.
I mean, it's that kind of thing. Like, if you can just get people in a room together, then And so then in your instance, the question is, what did it take to get people in the room together? And then, but then, anytime you have creative people working together and these networks mixing, then things are going to happen. Interesting. So I think you're right. Like, it was very much parallel. Our tour last fall was very much parallel to what was happening with you. So.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's good. It seems like, I mean, you also it helps to remember to be sort of opportunistic, right? That you shouldn't just take the schedule and be like, this is the thing I'm going to be doing as part of this project, right? Like, what mattered for you was also keeping an eye on how to go to what's happening outside the schedule, or like.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's something that I'm really interested in. Like Sun Tzu. There's a Sun Tzu quote that's like, if you're I'm paraphrasing. If you're skilled in the conventional and the orthodox and the unorthodox, you're infinite. Your end is your beginning, and your beginning is your end.
Right.
So there's this quality of being kind of grafted into like an institutionally sanctioned, structured setting that has sort of finite boundaries and specific aims. But then there's also this like grassroots DIY networking thing happening more like subliminally that can sort of complete that work.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's interesting.
That's like, it seems like an important part of the story in a way, is all those other things. Well, cool. Maybe we should take a break for some music for a little bit. More international collaboration music stuff, and we can regroup and talk a little bit more about the history of some of these projects, maybe, because there's a really cool backstory to this whole cultural envoy, musical ambassador, musical diplomacy thing. Welcome back to the Duttycast. Once again, a monthly event that's going to be live streamed and archived and podcast, hosted by Dutty Artz.
Super high tech Dutty Arts.
Yeah, super high tech, media savvy, whatnots that we are. There's even a hashtag Duttycast. So you can tweet us questions or comments or report.
Next month, we'll feature a performance by Matt Shade Tech, performing live remixing his new album.
Yeah, a whole broadcast of the live remix of Matt Shade Tech's new album. So don't miss that, because it's going to be awesome. We're here talking about international music collaboration and kind of some of the personal social politics and also the geopolitics around it. And it may have been surprising to see Dizzy Gillespie up there, but actually it's totally apropos because he and his band in 1956 were the first band to go on tour funded fully by the US State Department as part of its foreign policy, which in fact is the precursor to a lot of the projects we're talking about now that take state funding, that are US state funding. Because in other countries, governments often fund a lot more of the arts. In the US, you have the NEA, which isn't so big and doesn't fund international stuff. And other than that, it's really a lot of it's the State Department, which are a foreign policy entity. So Kendra is going to give us a little background, a little history on what that was about in the 50s and what it's turned into now, if you don't mind. That would be awesome.
I don't mind. Let me try to give you a brief overview. Boima, thank you for the Gillespie track. It was perfect. Playing Night in Tunisia, right? It's doubly perfect. Not only was Gillespie and his band from 56 the first jazz ensemble that the State Department sent abroad, but they sent them to the Middle East first. So it's so it's really symbolic there. There are a number of programs around which the U.S. used arts and culture to try to repair, or maybe not even repair, hone their image abroad, right? One of the most famous ones is the Jazz Ambassadors Program, which is what Dizzy Gillespie was a part of on that 1956 tour. So basically, in the 50s, in the Cold War context, the U.S. State Department worked with private booking agencies and private tour agencies to get some of the biggest names in jazz and send them abroad.
And why jazz? What was the image problem the U.S. had in the 50s and 60s?
So if you think about it, the U.S. was kind of fighting an international Cold War battle for ideological supremacy, and a battle at home on the domestic front with the civil rights movement, right, which was just getting started, and Eisenhower was in office. And sending jazz abroad was great for the U.S. for a couple of reasons. One, it was already really commercially successful and popular in Europe, so they knew it would find instant audiences, and they wanted to be on the edge of that. And two, it was a way of counteracting the image of the U.S. abroad in regards to their domestic civil rights issues. So if they sent especially African-American, but not only, but especially African-American jazz artists abroad, they could counteract the idea that civil rights issues the state wasn't willing or able to take care of those issues at home.
So to counteract critiques from other places that the U.S. had a problem with racism, they sent the jazz ambassadors abroad to sort of represent how supportive the government could be of African Americans, African American culture, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that was part of it, right. So jazz going abroad to Soviet countries, to Soviet-aligned countries, after the 1960s, right, to non-aligned countries, to recently post-colonial countries, because these tours extended into the 1960s, in order to influence tastemakers abroad, and also to make the point that even if African Americans and other differentially marked Americans were facing discrimination at home, their cultural products were things the state was happy to claim as American cultural products. Right. And so they would sort of be giving them shine that way. And also the idea that even if someone on a tour, Gillespie, for example, had issues with domestic politics and they wanted to speak about those abroad, that was okay, because the U.S. was big enough and diverse enough they could contain that critique, right? That critique could be leveled and that would still be okay. You also have to remember one more thing, is that jazz was seen for some people in and outside of the U.S. as a metaphor for democratic participation. The kinds of interaction people do, the kind of improvisation people do. It was really seen as a metaphor for freedoms for some people. So.
Okay. So what's that turned into then? if you
So
don't mind.
the Jazz Ambassadors Program is now one of a suite of things that the U.S. State Department does, sending music and culture abroad. So there's people going abroad and also people coming to the U.S. And on the going abroad side, there's now something known as the Rhythm Road Program, which is the descendant of the Jazz Ambassadors. So taking ensembles that compete for the chance to be selected by the State Department, and whatever whatever like private arts administration institution is kind of facilitating that on the domestic side. For example, at one point it was Jazz at Lincoln Center. It's been other NGO kind of things as well. They will take 8 or 9 different ensembles from across the board, a bunch of different genres, including hip hop, including jazz, including bluegrass, Cajun and Zydeco, like even chamber ensembles. There's a wide spectrum of musics now. And send them abroad to do short tours to like groups of countries, whether it's the MENA region, which, as you can imagine, has really seen more and more cultural participation. So the Middle East, North Africa region, especially since 9/11, has seen maybe not the majority, but a lot of this kind of cultural diplomacy work. And one of the reasons is that it speaks to kind of a tension within the whole idea of sending artists abroad. And that's, who do you reach with your tour, with your ensembles? Do you reach the elite, the tastemakers, the people that the ambassadors or the members of the embassy are already in contact with on a daily basis? Or do you reach a wide public with a whole bunch of youth and people that don't necessarily get to go to these elite venues, right? So there's really been kind of a cycle over the history of this program and the Jazz Ambassadors Program and its descendants, trying to figure out which is the best of those two groups, broadly speaking, to target. And I think now, post 9/11, we're really looking at a much broader audience. The trend has really been towards youth, and trying to focus on big shows and collaborations with youth musicians and amateur youth musicians. So you see more artists doing workshops, you see more artists doing like spur of the moment collaborations with other local groups, you see more performances that involve local groups, and you see those like being performed in venues that can reach much larger amounts of people.
So you mentioned before about jazz being seen by, I guess, maybe participants as well as folks in government and other folks as embodying democratic values. Is there something that's taken that place now? Is there something that's being promoted as embodying like American democracy abroad now?
I'm going to answer that with my opinion, right? This in no way is something that I've heard from a State Department employee or anything. But just in my opinion, I think in particular, hip hop is something that doesn't necessarily embody democratic participation in the same way, but that people see as associated with those same ideas of potential freedom, potential the potential to critique is kind of embedded in the form in the same way that people saw jazz and especially bebop as having the potential for critique embedded in the form. Whether you do something with that or not is really up to the artist, right? But that's always there, so that possibility is there, and I think that says a lot to people that the State Department is willing to send that abroad with its potential and its history, right? Even if the examples that you get aren't explicit about that, the idea that it's within and that could come out at any time is, I think, important.
Right. So is that one of the reasons why the State Department is funding so much in the Middle East and in North Africa, is to spread those particular kinds of potentials for practices?
My understanding, just from various conversations I've had with embassy personnel, again, just from my research in Morocco, so this is a limited number of people that I've talked to, but my understanding is that the logic is essentially the same, right? The assumptions, the associations that State Department officials and Foreign Service personnel saw amongst the people they were working with in the countries they were working with jazz in the 50s and 60s, they now analogize that to the ways people receive hip hop in those same places, right? So people that were like teens and young adults in the 50s and 60s, the way they received jazz, they're now analogizing that to the way that teens and young adults receive hip hop in those places. So they're really seeing it as just like sort of a natural progression, the same logic at work.
Thanks for explaining. Did you want to jump in on that? It looked like you had.
I'm good. No.
Okay, I wanted to ask Boima actually about the work you've done, because I know you've collaborated with hip hop folks and dance music folks in different places, and I'm wondering if you saw if people made statements or thought or acted about hip hop in that way at all, that they thought it embodied values, either American values or particular values that, in that kind of way, that were political values, that were values about, how the world was supposed to be, like, or was it more focused on,
You mean like what is the perception of American hip hop abroad, pretty much?
Yeah, or and not just that, but the practice of doing it as well. So the perception of American hip hop coming, but also like if you go and collaborate with someone doing something like hip hop, what do they think they're doing with you? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, the person that I'm collaborating with?
Yeah, I was thinking in practically first. I mean, either anything you think of is interesting, but like I was thinking especially about, what about the practice of doing this? Do people say?
Okay, I would probably try to reframe the idea of hip hop as an American thing. Like it is an American thing, but it's also a youth thing, right? And so I in some ways, like I being an American, symbolize some kind of access to abroad, right? For people who can't get visas, who can't. And that was very much my experience in Liberia. And I think every cultural context changes, every national context, every urban context changes. But I'll just speak about Liberia, is that I was access to the outside world, right?
Regardless of what kind of music you were doing, just because of who you were.
Exactly. And I think that's any kind of American or Europeans traveling. That's generally what you're gonna get when you interact with people in non-Western places.
Right.
But as far as hip hop, I'd say that like hip hop is adapted to local context so much, and it has been within the US. Like, LA hip hop and New York hip hop and Houston hip hop all became local things.
Right.
So much so that it wasn't even an issue. It was like, oh, this is New York influence.
Right.
In some places it was, like some places like, this is New York hip hop and that's all they listen to, and it wasn't New York. But at the same time, I think that the young people who are participating in it just see it as a means of global participation.
Okay.
And that hip hop is the norm for global like Facebook age and cell phones and that kind of thing. So I mean, I wouldn't say that like Malian hip hop isn't Malian hip hop or is an Americanized hip hop. Now, I think the difference is like, we want to talk about institutions and what the perception is. I think that governments, especially like in a society where it's like elder youth dynamic, like Liberia, have a negative view of hip hop as a kind of like bad influence on the society.
Okay.
And I think that's still prevalent in a lot of places. And a lot of my work, like in Sierra Leone, I've done a lot of like research and looking at what's happening there. And it's very much so that it's like, man, all they do is hip hop. Like, what happened to our good music, our good cultural music? Like, but the young people, this like, it is a way for them to engage with society in a way that's empowering. That is important. And they see, and for me, it's a very kind of like localized way of expressing that it's not conceptually American in a sense. It's only American in the sense that like America is global.
Right. Interesting. Did you get a sense of any of those dynamics when you were collaborating with people around what people saw as it doing for them in the kind of global context, or any of the other things that Boima was identifying?
Yes, but it was very oblique. I didn't have like explicit conversations with people where they talked to me about what hip hop meant to them.
Right.
Like our conversations were more just colloquial. You know what I mean? It was more like, "What's up? How you doing? Like, what are you gonna do with this person tonight on the show?" Like there wasn't a lot of time or space to get into deep, like philosophical excursions, but I definitely got a lot of well, I mean, my main exposure would have been through Matoni, because Matoni and I did really talk deeply about kind of what it was like for her to do music,
Mhm.
to try to do her music in Nairobi.
Mhm.
Um, and um, and she talked in detail about how there were these how the music was striated into different forms, and there was this kind of like very very sort of street level like folk music that
Mhm.
was sold on cassettes and whatnot, and was I mean, what she was saying wasn't qualitative. She wasn't saying that it wasn't good music. She was
Right.
just saying that it was regarded as like very, I guess, like grassroots or basic. I think
Mhm.
maybe she just meant it as a folk traditional music, you know.
Mhm.
And then there was like a kind of another tier above that, and that the sort of aspect of the music industry in Nairobi that she was involved with, which is the dance and hip hop music that's being distributed through the cell phone companies, and is sort of indicative of a well, first of all, like as Boima said, like youth culture, but also now I'm not totally clear about this, but also had some sort of class dynamic present in it,
Mhm.
and that though there's a large percentage of undercapitalized people in Nairobi, there's a concentration of I guess what would be the middle and upper middle class within the demographic that consumes this music via the cell phone and whatnot.
Right.
Now, Boy, you'd be in a better position to corroborate this type of thing than I would, because I've never been to Africa. But I think what was interesting about it, more so than having a like encyclopedic knowledge of the subject, which I clearly do not have, was just that I got the opportunity to sort of get a glimpse of a music industry that is practiced in a like totally foreign way. I mean, I didn't know that music is disseminated by the cell phone companies, that in Africa the big music distributors are the cell phone companies. Do you know what I mean? And like that
Yeah.
for me was like a really kind of blew my mind. um in terms of getting like really specific about embracing the form, that there were some tangential things, like I mean, I'm like I grew up in DC, and I live in Bushwick and stuff, and I've just been exposed to kind of like hip hop vernacular and kind of jazz vernacular my whole life, and I use it very liberally and unself-consciously, although I should maybe some self-conscious, I should maybe develop some of that. but but like, and she commented about my language, that it was sort of that she kind of she was able to understand how certain words were used
Uh-huh.
in a way that she'd been sort of like approximating something, or people that she knew had been approximating
Mhm.
something, and that like to be with me and other people within the OneBeat network who kind of
Mhm.
had a real intuitive grasp of that slang vernacular, like kind of helped her to sort of get a handle on, okay, that's how that word really works in a
Mhm.
sentence, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And that was, it's like a very subtle point, but that was very interesting to me,
Yeah.
because I think of myself to a certain extent as being on the outside of the hip hop conversation, because I see it as something that basically comes.
But like culturally, you're not though. Like
I
yeah,
know, but it's kind of both are true,
yeah.
because I see it as something that sort of essentially comes by way of Africa to the United States, and evolves as part of the American popular music discussion,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, and within the context of African American urban youth communities, and I mean, realistically, where I pick up on it is at the point in its evolution where it's being marketed
Yeah.
to white people, basically. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I mean, that is, though I grew up in DC in an urban setting, I mean, I heard Tribe Called Quest because I like saw it on MTV. It's not like I was like building in ciphers on the stoop. Like, that's not where I was coming from, you know what I mean? So I saw myself as being on the outside of it, you know what I mean? But then here was this person from Africa who I look at as this like really legit hip hop artist, and then she's kind of sort of relating to like hearing the language that I'm like very accustomed to using, and sort of representing herself as on the outside of it, whereas I would have looked at her and felt like, you're like as on the inside of it as it gets. Do you know
Right.
what I mean? So
Interesting.
that was like a very very subtle and kind of minute detail, but also like really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I think that's great. We're actually almost at the end of time, which is not of all time, but of our time. Yeah, that's it. Goodbye, world. But which is kind of amazing because actually I think this is an awesome conversation. What's great about it is that we had wanted to extend this conversation further with more participants at some point in the future. Y'all be welcome back, or we could do some kind of crazy internet collaboration. I wanted to pull out a couple points that I thought were really interesting because that's my prerogative as moderator. Woo! I get some. And one is the really interesting thing, Boima, that you said about youth culture in Liberia, and that you said there was a split between the government aligning itself with the sort of culture of the elders and seeing youth culture as threatening. Did I get that right? Is that they're seeing that? I mean, like, of course, there's many other things going on, but that dynamic, and connecting that to some of the discussions about the Arab Spring and interests in hip hop and U.S. interests in funding hip hop in the Middle East, right? That is, there's different times when finding things threatening to local governments may be in state interests of other governments, right? That is, the U.S. is very excited about youth culture that threatens certain governments when the U.S. has decided it doesn't like those governments.
Well,
right.
In the Liberia context, I would say that was actually wrong, like not the case at all. Yeah. I think the U.S. is actually more invested in the elders and the elite in that case. So, so if you're talking about support, the youth of Liberia are getting zero support from.
Well, exactly, but that's what I mean, right? It predicts that dynamic to some extent. If the U.S. does not have an interest in supporting youth culture, the same hip hop youth culture that happens in these other places, right? But it's not supporting it because those dynamics are different, right? Which is interesting because when the dynamics go the other way, the U.S.
Mama Ellen is a superhero. Come on.
But that's what I'm saying, right? When the interests go the other way, right? Because the U.S. is involved in a lot of festivals and stuff. Right?
Can I complicate this a little bit? Yeah. So just to add on to that a little bit, in the Moroccan case, and this is really the only thing I can speak about in detail, there is a reform movement in Morocco, right? But very few of, really, I can only think of one hip hop artist that's been at all visible and visibly allied with that reform movement, and that person is in jail. And all of the people that I worked with were very cautious about stating one way or the other how they felt about that movement, precisely because not just the US, but other non-governmental organizations that are actually part of foreign governments, like the Institut Français, or the version of that from Germany, or the version of that from Spain, or the version of that from Britain, right? The Goethe Institute, the Institut Cervantes, all of those, right? They were also interested in promoting youth culture. The U.S. was interested in promoting youth culture. The Moroccan state was interested in promoting youth culture post 9/11, partially because of its strong relationship with the U.S., and then post 2003 because of suicide bombings that happened in Casablanca. So the Moroccan state took on really similar tactics to the kinds of things that the U.S. does in other parts of the world. So there, in contrast to what Boima is saying, there's a situation where you have both the Moroccan state and other governments, and they're all like uniformly interested in promoting youth culture. They have their own various reasons, but they use the same tactics, right? And now post the originating moment of the Arab Spring, not post it, but like after that beginning, right? There is still a pretty weak kind of directionless reform movement going on in Morocco. And you might comment, I'm not making this claim, but I can see someone making this claim. You might comment that the state's support for youth arts and youth culture is one of the things that keeps people from being that interested in the kinds of movement politics that the reform movement is doing.
The state of Morocco.
Yeah.
Yeah, the state of Morocco, right? There's interesting alignments here. So yeah, it's not like I'm not trying to reframe everything as there's one, evil mastermind, but more that, right, that these dynamics shift depending on these geopolitical things. So why is there so little support for youth culture in Liberia and so much in Morocco?
Yeah. Right? Like the politicians invest in it based on the wins of popularity, and what gets them reelected, and it's a dynamic situation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think we should wrap it up, but thank you guys for a fantastic
Thank you.
conversation. I thought it was all great and could go on forever. Thank you, Dutty Artz. Thank you, Shanti and Gecko and Tanu for the tech support. And we'll follow up on Twitter later.